was a very powerful empire, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, very old, and it stretched along the Mediterranean Sea, around where Europe is today, and it was very powerful. And so this is the story of two twins who are slaves in the Roman Empire. Slaves are basically people who work for no money and they don't get anything. Okay?
But they're forced to work. They're not there because they want to.
The Roman twins. Young Maximus, though just a boy, was doomed to be a slave and serve a cruel master from the cradle to the grave. Although he worked from dawn till dusk, no matter how he tried, his owner, Slobus Pompeius, was never satisfied. Vanilla, his twin sister, worked for Lady Pompeius, a proud and haughty woman who created such a fuss. If pots and pans weren't gleaming, her hair was not done right. That poor Vanilla crawled to bed exhausted every night. The slaves were always given heaps of heavy work to do, and when one job was finished, Slobus thought of something new. The task which they most hated, which really wore them down, was carrying the litter when their owners went to town. Then Maxie and Vanilla had to trudge with aching feet along the hot and dusty road and down the cobbled street. Not daring to complain, nonetheless the pair felt bitter, forced to fetch and cart around two fatties on a litter. They left their lazy master at the public baths each day, where he would gorge and gossip just to pass the time away. The slaves, meanwhile, pressed on, never tarrying or stopping, carrying their mistress on an endless round of shopping. The streets were very stony, and the youngsters' feet would bleed, when Lady P went bargaining for things she didn't need. Then back they go for Slobus to continue their ordeal, by tottering off home again to make the evening meal. Now, one day, Slobus went to buy a chariot and a horse, imagining the neighbors would be most impressed, of course, to see him and his lady gaily galloping around. But horses can be difficult, as Slobus quickly found. Though Polydox, the trusty horse, was gentle with each slave, when Slobus Pompeius approached, he'd snort and misbehave. And Slobus, in a rage at this embarrassing defeat, decided he would sell the horse and use him to buy meat. Vanilla and her brother pleaded for the creature's life, but Slobus would not change his mind, and neither would his wife. So out into the field that night the daring twosome crept, and stole away with Polydox, while nasty Slobus slept. Next morning, when their master found their cold and empty beds, he flew into a temper and declared he'd have their heads. And Lady Pompeius went wild and said it wasn't fair. Who was there now to clean her house and tidy up her hair? Slobus asked his cousin, who was captain of the legion, to send his men forthwith on the search throughout the region. The captain told him boastfully that once he'd caught the slaves, he'd spare their lives long enough to make them dig their graves. So up and down the soldiers searched the town till darkness fell, but where their prey was hidden, it seemed nobody could tell. But where the troops grew lackadaisical and soon marched home for tea, the captain of the legion was as disgruntled as could be. Then Slobus was beside himself with anger and despair, with nobody to wait on him and comb his lady's hair. He swore he'd find the fugitives, and with their lives they'd pay. His victims, in the interim, had safely snuck away. For now the slaves and Polydox were snugly bedded down, while hidden in a stable in the humblest part of town. Their host was named Spontaneous, and though he risked his life, he chose to help his friends, and so did Chubia, his wife. Spontaneous and Chubia sold kindling in the street, but being very poor, they barely had enough to eat. And Moxie and Vanilla, though welcome to their share, were fed for doing nothing, and felt it wasn't fair. They knew they were a burden, till they heard Spontaneous say the emperor would hold the annual chariot race next day. At this, the twins, who thought of maybe giving themselves up, agreed instead to enter for the emperor's gold cup. Knowing well that Polydox would not obey a stranger, they took the reins themselves, disregarding any danger. By luck, the rule for racing was that everybody must tie in a kerchief round the face to keep away the dust.
Now, once the race began, before the vast and cheering crowd, their horses' speeds and daring made the pair of them feel proud. Vanilla and her brother were elated and surprised, for Pollydox was swifter than they ever realized. Though horses fell and chariots crashed, and some were overturned, in spite of all the rumpus, Paradox seemed unconcerned. Around the wrecks he nimbly swerved, while never losing speed, and when they reached the finish, Pollydox was in the lead. When taken to the palace to receive the winner's prize, they entered with their kerchiefs off, no longer in disguise. And wouldn't you just know it, Slobus Pontius was there, to claim revenge against them, for he'd recognized the kid. The emperor was in a fix and wondered what to do. The law demanded runaways should suffer death, it's true. And yet he felt the common folk would think it a disgrace to punish plucky children who had triumphed in the race. But as the people waited for the emperor to choose, a messenger came bursting in and brought alarming news. The Ostrogoths were coming, and the most fierce and savage band, who had behavior caused a wave of panic in the land. And where were all the soldiers who were driving the Goths away? The Roman army, to a man, had gone on holiday. The hoarders would cross the Tiber Bridge, and if they were annoyed, they'd burn the whole of Rome, and therefore the bridge must be destroyed. The Knout spoke the spontaneous and gave the people hope, by pointing out that as the bridge was only held with rope, if some brave souls would volunteer to cut those ropes away, he'd guard them as they would work and also keep the Goths at bay. Then Cheldia spoke up. Her voice was quivering with pride, and said if he faced danger, she must be there by his side. And Maxie and Vanilla said that they would help him too, but barely had they started when the Goths came into view. The Ostrogoths all laughed to see Spontaneous alone. It tickled them to think one man would face them on his own. He wasn't much to look at, but it must be understood. His arms were strong and muscular from chopping all that wood. First, Wolfus, the unwashed one, who was the leader of the pack, with sword in hand and sneer on face, advanced to the attack. But when the Goths saw Wolfus flying with a single blow, no other thrown that any army was prepared to have a go. The ropes behind Spontaneous were quickly cut away. His friends, meanwhile, retreated as the bridge began to sway. Then, with the broken bridge behind and Ostrogoths before, he dived into the river and swam strongly to the shore. And when at last Spontaneous stood firmly on dry ground, the citizens rejoiced to see their hero safe and sound. The emperor saluted them and issued a decree. The slaves were given Pollydox, and both of them set free. To show the four his gratitude, he gave them gifts of gold. But seeing Slobus was still vexed, his look grew stern and cold. The white with rage, and hearing the ungrateful watch complain, he ordered Slobus by himself to build the bridge again. Triumphantly, the famous four paraded through the streets, and then a feast was held for them with lots of stray treats. Triumphantly, the famous four paraded through the streets, and then a feast was... Sorry. The party was attended by just everyone in Rome, except for Slobus and his wife, who sulked and stayed at home. This is the party they threw for them, and the feast. When all the fun and games were done, there's little more to tell, considering the hazards things had turned out to rather well. So Pollydox and Maximus, Vanilla and their friends, gained freedom, wealth, and glory, and that's where the story ends.